Good evening and welcome to this webinar on Synodality and the Evolving Church. We're delighted that you can all join us for this. I shall start by acknowledging the country that we are on. I'm normally on the Wurundjeri, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and they're the traditional custodians of country from where I normally broadcast. And I invite you to acknowledge the people of the land on which you currently stand or join us from. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I value and am inspired by the wisdom, spiritualities and experiences of First Nations people from across this land, the oldest living cultures in the world. I commit myself to walk softly and gently on country, and through dialogue and action, work actively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for justice, equity, reconciliation, and healing. And we'll start with a very brief prayer. One of the prayers that the Synod office has put out for prayers for Lent, and it's a prayer for listening. We pray that the deeply human reality of listening, given and received, remains central to our synodal experience together. May each of us be open to listening to the voice of the Spirit of God that accompanies us on this journey of change and conversion. We pray to the Lord. And as I said, I'm delighted to be with you this evening. For those who might know me, my name is Eleanor Flynn, and I'm the co-chair, one of the co-chairs of ACCCR, and I'm also one of the co-founders of WICH, Women's Wisdom in the Church, which is a Melbourne-based group. The format of this evening is that Kevin and then Francis will speak for 15 to 20 minutes each. After they've both spoken, there will be then time for questions. Please put your questions into the Q&A function of Zoom, not into the chat function. And then we'll go through the Q&A and attempt to get Kevin or Francis or both to answer as many questions as possible. Please either ask a brief question or provide a brief comment rather than a lengthy speech. As you know, this presentation is being recorded and will be available later for those who are not able to join us this evening. Okay, so the first speaker is Kevin Liston, who might actually need a little bit of invitation because he's actually been the organizer of all of these webinars. And in fact, he was the one who had the idea of having these webinars, for which we're eternally grateful, Kevin. And he started that with the Plenary Council and then the Synod. He's the other co-chair of ACCCR and the convener of the group South Australian Catholics for an Evolving Church. He's also very active in his parish and in St Vincent de Paul in Adelaide and South Australia. And he's passionate about developing a church where we all take responsibility. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Eleanor. I think that was a little bit over the top, but we'll carry on. Good evening, everyone. And just to be clear, this is not an ACCCR statement, but my personal views. Catholicism is at a crossroads. Most baptized Catholics have given up on the church organization. They find the spirituality and theology on offer to be inadequate. Rules and practices and exclusions do not make sense. Credibility of bishops and clergy is at an all-time low. Many of my family, friends and colleagues wonder what I find in it and why I continue to be involved. I don't think I'm alone in this. Catholicism is evolving. At this time in the West or global North, it is in decline, rapidly diminishing in credibility, influence and relevance. Yesterday I heard Austin Ivory, the Pope's biography, describe the Synod as the most important event in the Catholic Church since Vatican II. I have questions about that this evening. Spirituality is the word most commonly used to express our personal religious stance. So I would like to clarify at the outset what I mean by spirituality. Spirituality sums up my living as an integrated, biological, sensitive, thinking, deciding, and loving human being. It is not just the thinking, reflective, deciding part. It is that, but includes the bodily part too. It is the whole of who I am. It also includes the core meanings and values that I live by. In the mid-20th century, most people found their identity in belonging to groups or communities, including churches and other religious groups. Much of the success of Vatican II lay in its reconnecting with social and community experiences and values. The change of era that we are now experiencing was heralded by the science revolution. Rights of people to determine their own destiny led to decolonization. The women's movement challenged many deep and long-held prejudices. Education has changed the fortunes and lifestyles of millions, as has increased prosperity and economic conditions. Developments in technology and communications have accelerated the process. A movement of individuation, which is not simply individualism, has led to a major shift of attention from the social to the personal in relation to how we live our lives. Carl Jung, Karl Rahner, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, and Gandhi were all key figures in this shift, along with many, many others. Philosophers call it the turn to the subject. The shift towards individuation with more focus on personal experience, values, and relationships has changed the context of our spiritual lives. Most Australian Catholics no longer look to the organisation for answers. The simple explanations of childhood continue to be trotted out. Critical thinking is not encouraged. Many now feel they are left to their own resources in developing a mature theology of life. Catholics increasingly look to one another or to other secular friends. The child sex abuse revelations accelerated the erosion of credibility of church leaders. There is much good theology about it. It could provide a solid basis for a contemporary spirituality, but accessing it is not always easy. The 2021 census reported just under 6 million self-declared Catholics in Australia. It is generally accepted that only about 10% or 600,000 people have any engagement with the Church. In other words, 90% or 5.4 million self-declared Catholics do not have any direct involvement. I think it would be fair to say that a significant proportion of the 5 million are good people with strong faith, deep-rooted spirituality and commitment to the values of Jesus. They are truly practicing Catholics, even if mass attendance censuses do not count them. This means there are more practicing Catholics outside the church organization than within it. Many Catholics now distinguish between A, the informal movement involving people of God and followers of Jesus, and B, the institution or organization. That is not to say that none of those with institutional roles are part of the self-guided, free-flowing movement. But organizational bias and maintenance of the institution often take precedence in their commitments. Likewise, movement-oriented Catholics may adhere to very traditional norms in their personal lives. The matter is not clear-cut. Clericalism is one symptom of the division. It is evident not only in the behavior of individual priests, but also in the easy manner in which bishops and other church people presume to tell everyone else how to contribute to consultations on the future of Catholicism and the topics that they can discuss. The distinction is also evident in the disparity between what the organization teaches and what Catholics believe and practice. This discrepancy will not be resolved by logic, reason, canon law, or an appeal to tradition, but by paying attention to grown-up Catholics as they respond to the promptings of the Spirit towards authentic living. The inability of the organization to keep pace with changing circumstances has left many of us disillusioned. When the Synod was announced in 2021, it raised great hope and expectations among Catholics in Australia and around the world. We knew the Church was in decline and saw this as an opportunity for reform and spiritual renewal. The theology underlying most preaching was out of step with our times. We longed for a Catholicism that would speak to the needs and opportunities of the 21st century. However, basic Catholic teaching and doctrinal positions were excluded from the Synod agenda, and the outcomes of the worldwide consultations were duly sanitized. Since the first Synod Assembly last October, two important documents have been issued by the organizers. The synthesis report is a listing of 115 matters on which there was convergence, 75 matters for consideration, and 81 proposals for action, 273 in all. But they're largely concerned with organizational processes and issues rather than the spirituality of the people. The Council of the Synod Secretariat issued towards October 2024 a set of directives stating how further consultations should be conducted. The approach is top-down, synodality by decree. And the guiding question, how can we be a synodal church in mission, does not directly address any of the issues listed in the synthesis report. It is worth noting that the Synod receives little promotion either at diocesan or parish levels. The vast majority of Catholics know nothing about it and are not interested in finding out. Why? Because they see it as irrelevant to their lives. The Synod and synodality for the people seem to be parting company. Many church leaders appear to forget that the church is a voluntary organization and that what is decided by them is not automatically taken up by others. The present change of era provides wonderful opportunities for taking Catholicism and Christianity forward. An educated laity with capacity for lifelong education means we are better informed and better able to give direction and purpose to our lives than ever before. It was never so easy to communicate widely. The internet allows access to information on a scale unimaginable at the time of the Second Vatican Council. Now, we know that we are able. We understand how the scriptures were compiled and doctrines developed in the context of their times, places, and cultures. As we recognize a variety of inculturations in the past, we are alerted to the possibility and need for further inculturation in the present. We need a fresh narrative, new language, to express the revolutionary vision and mission of Jesus in our day. This is so obvious that it should not need to be said. This is not about compromising the truth and reality of Jesus, the love of God, or the action of the Spirit in our lives. Much of our inherited narrative relies on metaphors and the worldviews of first century Palestine and Europe in the Middle Ages. But our environment and culture are characterized by science and its methods, an educated population, democratic ideals, and wonderful technology. Even blind Freddy could see the problem. We are in a period of transition. Both engaged and disengaged Catholics who are hanging on to core elements of their inherited spirituality are, for the most part, keenly aware of its shortcomings in relation to life in the 2020s. They're searching, questioning, and questing show commitment to the vision of Jesus and concern for future generations. Many of us experienced and gratefully remember the optimism and energy that flowed after Vatican II. Critiquing prevailing narratives and social and economic practices was a profound affirmation of our inherent worth, our spirituality, and gospel values. It is very ironic that today, 60 years later, in a very different world, we are told what we should be thinking about and talking about and the positions we should hold. We Catholics do not all hold the same beliefs, doctrines, and moral positions, nor should we be expected to. Even the minority who still engage through liturgies, sacraments, and other devotional practices use their own judgments on matters such as family planning, acceptance of LGBTIQ+ and repartnered people, sacramental reconciliation, and cohabitation. When this is brought into the open and freely discussed, the variety of positions will be held positively. There will be tension, but that is part of a healthy debate. It is not necessarily a negative. People reach spiritual authenticity when they are able to go beyond parenting and guidance of law and rules to thinking in the spirit of Jesus. Paul's letter to the Galatians is very relevant here. The working together of synodality means traveling with people who have different positions and a variety of perspectives on life. Otherwise, we are just a domestic parade of uniformity. We Catholics are now finding our voices and expressing our desire for renewal and a mature spirituality. We are focusing more clearly than ever on heightening our awareness and appreciation of what we have inherited. Acting with the spirit of life in small groups and individually, we are using our God-given initiative to transform that inheritance and ourselves for the future. We no longer think of ourselves as fallen people, as people distanced from the love of God who need to make a sacramental or ritual sacrifice in order to be restored to good favor. As the evidence demonstrates, we humans came to be what we are through a process of evolution. There is a basic goodness and a natural desire to know, to be more, to love, and to be all we can be in our evolutionary DNA. We are a people working our way towards a more authentic world. We are free people. Our focus is on expanding our liberation, not on spending time and energy on seeking remission for our failings, though we readily acknowledge them. Let's remember what Jesus told various people. Your sins are forgiven, and move on. He did not say, I forgive you, but simply that they are already forgiven. God does not carry grudges. The coincidence of major changes in the world we inhabit and the seismic shift in how we humans interact with it has earthquake-sized consequences. The Synod and Synodality has relevant potential in this situation, but it must be taken out of the cavernous Paul VI hall to local meeting rooms and homes in Sydney and Melbourne, in Geraldton and Wagga Wagga, and everywhere in between. And it must be synodality with teeth. People coming together to discern, draw plans, and make binding decisions. We have had enough window dressing for the decisions of others. Involvement without being able to make decisions that stand is for children. It is not real participation. Spirituality today is moving towards a much greater emphasis on personal responsibility and authenticity. Organization is necessary, but it has its place. It facilitates our growing from spiritual childhood and adolescence to being autonomous adults in the community. The primary question has shifted from what does the church teach to How am I to find my way? Being Christian is not just practice of a religion. It is someone you become. This is not about whether Catholicism is a movement or an organization. It is about people. We need organization and structure in our lives, but we also need the freedom to grow beyond the structures, to flourish personally and spiritually. As children grow out of a need for parental strictures and guidance, we too must grow out of the childish or adolescent spiritualities we grew up with and become responsible adults, making our own decisions about how we live and relate to others, guided by the Spirit, our sense of the faith that evolves within us. Personal spirituality, as well as theology, is rooted in and grows out of our day-to-day experiences, the prayers that spontaneously emerge from our hearts, and the insights that grace moments of reflection. Scripture and tradition provide guidance and history, but growth comes from experiential learning, the interactions of people with one another, and supportive circles of relationships. We can use our own experience as a starting point, asking questions about inherited practices, being creative with fresh ideas and possibilities, and make our own judgments about what is real, what is true, what is valid in our own lives. Our awareness of the evolution of the universe and of humanity expands our understanding of the history of salvation. We can now recontextualize Bible history. Pope Francis' motu proprio on promoting theology, issued in November last year, is most important in this context. He formally recognizes what many Catholics long ago sensed and accepted. Tradition and scripture are best appreciated and understood in the real-life context of every day. The experience of human living is the ground on which we build a coherent, integrated spirituality. Jesus could teach us a thing or two in this regard, if we listened to him. There is much to be learned from the sense of the faith of the faithful. That is the instinct for what is real and worthwhile that emerges from experience and reflection. Ignatius of Loyola spoke of this at length in relation to discernment of feelings. My parents back in Ireland had what I now regard as a disastrous theology, but they had a deep sense of core Christian values, of their relationships with God, Jesus, the action of the Spirit in their lives, and commitment to others. And it was that sense of who they were that carried them through all sorts of crazy situations. The history of the first settlements in Australia, the Amazon region today, and penal times in Ireland show that Catholicism can survive extreme circumstances on the sense of faith of the faithful. The question we began with has to be answered. What is the relevance of the Synod to the evolution of Catholicism? Features that we noted along the way include the change of era in the world and in Catholicism. Catholics are rapidly disengaging from the Church, differentiating between Catholicism as a movement and the Church organization. The inability of the Church to keep pace with our times in its structures, practices, its intellectual coherence, and its public credibility. The failure of the first assembly of the Synod in October 2023 to touch the imagination and get the attention of Catholics. The emergence of educated, informed, critically thinking, self-directing lay Catholics who are finding their voices and leading the push for renewal. The need for a fresh narrative and synodality with teeth. The centrality of the lived experience of ordinary Catholics for genuine spirituality and the sense of the faith of the faithful. To sum up, the world is changing fast. To date, our church, either as organisation or as the community of the followers of Jesus, has not coped well. But the situation is not hopeless. As our understanding of the emerging socio-cultural environment grows, we have opportunities as individuals and in discussion with family, friends, and colleagues to develop a new enculturation of the gospel. We don't need to wait for others to give us permission or to bless us in doing it. We know ourselves how to go about it. Already underway in scattered tentative forms, individuals and groups are shaping the future of Catholicism. They are the creative thinkers and doers who make paths by walking them, just as Jesus did, relying on their interior resources and thinking outside the square. We are all in this together, but the evidence so far shows that the Synod is not effective or likely to achieve its purpose. The church organisation from top to bottom must reform much of its practices and structure for this thing to work. I dream of a Catholic community with a meaningful, purposeful, and fulfilling ethos that enables each of us to grow in love and care for one another. Its theology, our rationale, is imbued with the awareness that the evolution of the universe and the natural world mediate a sense of awe and wonder at the scope of it all. We live in a world bigger than we know. Engaging with its future, with its further human and natural evolution, through being authentic, caring, and loving people is tremendously rewarding. I dream of an organisation that enables and empowers people, Catholics and others, to reach their full potential. This is about creating a new world and contributing to a new stage in the evolution of humanity. I love being involved in this glorious adventure with its energy and frustrations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kevin. The key things I think that you've come out with are very much that the Synod is a disappointment, but that we as Catholics, inside or outside the church, can do this ourselves and should be doing this ourselves. And that the church needs to look to science, technology, the changes in the world since the doctrines were first espoused. So thank you very much for that. And we shall now move on to Francis Sullivan. Francis might not need as much introduction as Kevin. He's the chair of Concerned Catholics Canberra Goulburn, was previously CEO of the Truth, Justice and Healing Council, and has recently been in roles as the chair of the Mater Group of Hospitals and Catholic Social Services Australia. And he's currently the incoming chair of Jesuit Social Services and is also a director of Mercy Health. The thing I find most interesting about Francis was his talk at a session I went to in Adelaide, where he talked about when he'd finished the Truth, Justice and Healing Commission and the work on that, he'd written a report, and to take his mind off all of it, he walked the Camino to Santiago de Compostela and managed to put a copy of the report on the tomb of St. James, which I think is a seriously encouraging thing. So thank you, Francis.
Thank you, Eleanor, and good evening, everybody. And thank you, Kevin, for that marvellous presentation. Your light has been under a bushel for too long. In the moments available to me this evening, I'd like to give a reflection on where I sit with the Synod on synodality. I do so because many fine Catholic friends either have no interest in the Synod, have not even heard about it, or have little hope that it will amount to anything. I think we all appreciate, as Kevin's already mentioned, that the interest and confidence in the Church is at an all-time low. The fact that a meeting in Rome, still heavily controlled by the Vatican, can somehow enliven the flagging fortunes of the Church is a bridge too far for the majority of my Catholic friends and the Catholic circles in which I move. Yet, I have hope, and even more than hope, I see some tentative green shoots of change. The Synod's synthesis document is a sincere attempt to contain the many viewpoints of the delegates. From many accounts, this document, written in haste near the end of the session, incorporated around 1,000 edits before going to print. If nothing else, the document is the fruit of plenty of passion. Clearly, the conversations in the spirit that enabled participants to listen and understand each other worked. That women and other lay people sat around tables with clerics and Vatican heavyweights also had an impact. A question that I'm still left with, though, comes from my experience with a similar process at the plenary council. That is, how free is the listening process when it is conducted within the institutional culture of prohibition? In other words, do people feel constrained to raise some issues because they feel it is futile, or worse, that they feel poorly judged? There is no doubt that some people, as with the plenary council, had one eye on orthodoxy and compliance to it, and the other on those who dared to even hint at straying from that now laboured path. Whether there was an atmosphere that really did have all the issues on the table at the Synod, including long-held church teachings, only those in the room can tell. What we do know from the contents of the synthesis document is that it has been shrewdly crafted and in itself offers something for most, but not everyone. Thankfully, the document does reflect the view that some areas of canon law need to be revisited in order for a more effective level of participation of the laity. As a matter of fact, it even goes further to suggest a major rewrite of the Code of Canon Law is needed. Many of the restrictions on the role of women and the full participation of lay people in the governance of the Church and in the sharing of otherwise ordained ministries are currently hampered by the Code. This move to revise the Code should be encouraged and openly supported. Pope Francis consistently emphasises that the mission of the Church is one of engagement in culture. History demonstrates that Catholic practice is downstream of culture. It is where the rubber hits the road for ordinary, decent living Catholics. It is the place where we live our incarnational reality. The place is where we seek goodness, truth, and grapple with uncertainty, confusion, and suffering. As the Brazilian theologian Leonardo Boff puts it, this is the place where we strive to keep the dream of Jesus alive. In more technical terms, it is where the kingdom of God, or we would call it the reign of God, plays out. As Boff says, the kingdom becomes present always and wherever people live in love, solidarity, forgiveness, mercy, and a humble acceptance of God. Our call is to live those values in our time and place, and to live them with confidence in our own agency and our own sense of what is right and just. And this place has the smell of sheep in the eyes of Pope Francis. This place is where the church needs to be, away from the abstractions and absolutes founded in times well past, and knee-deep in pastoral pathways that lead to human flourishing in the here and now. Our times are calling for the strident church positions to be quietly shelved in order to accommodate the pastoral needs of Catholic communities. Two of the major flashpoints are the equality of women and gender issues. These are shake-your-head nonsensical to younger generations that en masse have deserted the church. This is where our church needs to see movement at the Synod. From the public comments of those involved in drawing up the Synod's working documents, these two flashpoints issues were consistently raised across all continents and within bishops' conferences and religious leaders' forums. So is this the Spirit speaking to the church? I hope so. If the Synod on Synodality fails to take these issues forward, then it is very hard not to see this as a slap in the face for we in the West. The Synod is an opportunity to thrash out specific features of Catholic practice. In a sense, it is a litmus test of the flexibility and durability of the Church. As it stands, the Synod is both pertinent and remote to the lives of Catholics. It is questionable these days as to what degree local bishops have any credibility in the eyes of Catholics. For too long, the Church has stonewalled on issues regarding the equality of women and of same-sex relationships. The decline in participation numbers reflects the loss of patience by the Catholic community. The practice of the Catholic faith is local, culturally sensitive, and constrained by the limitations of human imagination and endeavour. It is where Catholicism happens. For the purists, this cannot lead to an anything goes, because they say Catholicism has universality as a feature. However, universality can never be translated to mean uniformity. Yet without avenues through which real dialogue on difficult issues can be held, uniformity becomes the rule. We need forums for the people impacted by the Church's positions to be around the table with those charged to hold the line. There has always been the competency for the Church to govern itself locally. This is called subsidiarity, and Pope Francis keeps encouraging our bishops to act accordingly. The synthesis document suggests a stronger devolution of governance to bolster the cultural change synodality is to bring to the Church. However, the fact that many of our bishops have been raised in anything but a locally empowered church means that they may well need a helpful nudge from the laity to get with the program. It follows then that a local expression of Catholicism, discerned within the structure of subsidiarity, will be an engagement with culture, a dialogue of values, in a common purpose of equal dignity and prosperity for all These will be the breastplates of human decency. It is the eternal quest. To a limited degree, the Synod's working principle of unity in diversity is a nod in this direction. The historical strength of the Church has been its capacity to hold the centre, whilst the tensions from the extreme play out. The authors of the Synod's synthesis document have pitched the controversial issues to the middle ground, often muted in their language to avoid being provocative. This can test the patience of those seeking more direct reforms, but at least it keeps some issues live, with the potential for them to be amplified in future meetings. I speak here specifically of the full participation of women, particularly in the diaconate, and the formal recognition and rights of the LGBTQI+ community. In the words of the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, these issues, along with others, have as much right to join the voices in the Catholic chorus of our time and culture as any other. The fact that they remain in play is a sign of their legitimacy. The fact that the authors have had to grapple with the language to accommodate them likewise gives credence to the significance of these issues for the final determination of the Synod. In other words, these issues are not going away anytime soon. That said, it is still hard to swallow. Not only is the language muted in reference to the LGBTQI+ community, the synthesis document makes no explicit mention of that community. There is no description of their experiences of exclusion, marginalisation, discrimination, and even violence in the Church. To all intents and purposes, the lives of those specifically named at times by Pope Francis as needing a merciful embrace are not afforded equality of treatment with other Catholics. If you didn't pick up the nuance in the language in the document, you would have felt that they had been disregarded altogether. This is hurtful and belittling. It also is asking a lot of the LGBTQI+ Catholics to take the Synod on trust. Even our own plenary council was shy of delivering in its decrees any explicit naming of the LGBTQI+ community. If nothing else, our church culture and its implicit biases must be more openly examined if we are to really become inclusive and compassionate for all. Setting aside the cultural and historical biases that have shaped church doctrine in this area, our faith and integrity as a church compels us towards inclusion, compassion, dignity, and respect. Therefore, in this interim phase of the Synod, it is even more vital that the voices of those marginalised in and by our church must remain front and centre. As Australian priest and theologian Richard Lannan puts it, the Spirit who, like the wind, blows where it chooses, can give voice to those who name for the ecclesial community what damages the church's communal mission and life, as well as what may enhance their integrity. He goes on to say, practices and policies in the church likely to silence, invisibilise, and demonize members of the ecclesial community, whether on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, social status, or any other criteria alien to the gospel, are likely to be in opposition to all that the grace of the Spirit embraces. The Nun stresses that the voices from the margins can stir the community of faith to reassess and become better aligned with the Spirit. In other words, they can deliver change. The synthesis document leaves the door open for change. It has not silenced the voices, but its accommodations to date are tentative. The degree to which the final Synod document is more bold and direct is to be seen. As I said earlier, the groundwork is there. Now it comes down to a coalition of the willing. Let me take the final part of the time to highlight some areas of the document that hold promise for effective reform. Firstly, as I said previously, a discerning reader can find many avenues in which to emphasise the areas of exclusion for remarried Catholics and members of the LGBTQI+ community. The document specifically mentions attention be given to exclusion in ecclesial services, liturgical, sacramental, to name just two. This clearly goes to issues of the reception of the Eucharist and formal blessing of civil unions. 2. Even though the issue of women in the diaconate has been referred for a further inquiry, the document encourages deeper examination of the issue. To me, this signals an openness in the Synod to bring on reform, not to resist it. You would have expected a more limited brief in the document if the disposition was negative. 3. On the issue of the full participation of laity in governance structures, the document is very specific. Synodality obliges a mutual, co-responsible participation of lay and clerical persons in decision-making processes. This will mean that canon law needs to be changed. But the attitude in the document does not find change to the Church's law something that should be resisted. 4. Accountability of the performance of bishops and the clergy generally is also on the table. This type of transparency is crucial if the trust of the community, both Catholic and beyond, is going to be restored. 5. It was pleasing to see that the issue of clerical sex abuse was not only mentioned, but recognised to be an unfinished project. Unless the cultural factors that led to and concealed the scandal are confronted, we are doomed for another scandal to arise. 6. At last, we have the suggestion of obligatory requirements for pastoral councils. Maybe the new model of synodality can characterise local, diocesan and national bodies. And in that light, it would be a positive gesture for the Australian bishops to establish synodal councils in each state and territory to assist with the implementation of the plenary council decrees and the final directions Pope Francis makes out of this synod. Let us hope that the lay involvement can be selected through a democratic and widely representative process, as opposed to the usual process with bishops handpick friendlies and company men, as some may well say, of which I was once one. The synodal process has already been a long and at times confusing one. It has asked of us a willingness to step up, listen and speak. Many in the Catholic community have spoken. Reform groups have particularly sought to raise the voices of the margins of the church, voices that echo because of the chasm in which they sound, voices that are both mystical and threatening. They call for attention and inquiry. They are a lure for discovery with the promise of an emergent Catholicity. These voices are part of our incarnational reality. They are the expression of grace and become part of the whole when listened to. Yet there is a space between the voices and the current configuration of the church. But as Rowan Williams says, in this space we encounter God. The church's focus on structures, doctrine, ritual, and practice must not obscure the deeper things these elements are designed to hold and express. That is the way of Jesus, the presence to us all and all humanity, in, with, and through the reality of our lives, of a God who is love. And that energy of love sees all, holds all, and heals all. For the church to represent anything contrary to this, it would be a travesty, not only of our call and responsibility, but of the collective. The Synod on Synodality is the opportunity to let go and reimagine a truly authentic response to the gospel. Let's pray that that is our pathway. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francis, for, as usual, a very thoughtful and slightly more hopeful presentation, perhaps, about the Synod. I think we're in a time of liminality, a time between an old and a not yet situation, which is always a time of great uncertainty and can be a time of chaos, but also can be a time of great hope and change. So let's hope that we come out of this in a more positive way. I'm now going to go through the questions and ask some of them, and I'll batch some of them together. The first one was for Kevin. Could you explain the difference between individuation and individualization or individualism?
Okay, thanks, Eleanor. My understanding of it is I see individualism as a focus on the individual as the center of my own life. For me, individuation is a recognition that I am an individual facing the world, working with other people, that traditionally the scholastic theology had very little interest in what the individual thinks or feels or whatever. It was an out there kind of theology that dealt with the non-personal, if you like. It was very theoretical, and individual and personal feelings didn't come into play very much. More recently, it emerged through philosophies like existentialism and so on, that we cannot deal with the world as if we are not ourselves thinking, responsible, authentic human beings. We need to do both of them. The individualist and individualism are very much about the focus being on me. Individuation is me recognizing that I have my individuality and I have it in relation to the whole world. I am not the center, I am part of the whole lot, but I'm a valid part and an important part, and I'm responsible for this particular part.
Thank you very much. A question about the sense of faith, the sensus fidelium. Perhaps Francis first. Do you detect any real intent from the hierarchy of recognizing the need for acknowledging the sense of faith of the faithful?
You know, I've grappled with that a lot. Where I would be at the moment is that there's no doubt there are very senior members of the hierarchy who are all for the synodal process, and at its heart of the synodal process is naming not only the issues confronting us as a church, but also, in a sense, trying to align with our lived experience. That's why I think Kevin's point in his talk was really important, that this document that's come out from the Pope emphasising the, if you like, theological method based on our lived experience is very timely. Just in plain pragmatic terms, more of the same is not going to work for us in Australia. It hasn't been working for a long time. And anybody in a leadership role, a bishop or religious leader, who thinks all we need to do is hunker down and this terrible time will pass, I really think is being naive. The sense of the Catholic community and what it's been calling for has been consistently calling for decades for the type of issues we've spoken about this evening. And you'd have to be, as Kevin said, blind Freddy to not realise what's going on.
Thank you. Did you have anything to add, Kevin?
I fully agree with what Francis is just saying. And in relation to that motu proprio by the Pope, I find myself questioning why that document has not been translated from Italian and Latin, which is what has been produced in, because it is highly relevant to the whole world as a statement of the involvement, the natural place of people and the experience. But why has it not been translated? I don't know. I can only suspect.
Yes. And maybe one for you, Kevin. Do you think that the theology of humans as part of the evolving universe, rather than a small view of humans dominating the earth, do you think this is an evolutionary theology would help change the church?
Yes, it would, because it comes from below. We emerged out of originally the atoms and the molecules that floated around in space. As Dennis Edwards says, we're made from stardust. And there's a gradual evolution to the chemical complexities, the biological becoming organisms, the later arising of intelligence and whatever in humans, that it's a process that has been happening. It happens in each one of us from the time that first zygote is formed in the womb or in the fallopian tubes to where we are today as individuals. And it's part of that evolution. And I see myself as being, if you like, a living reality of both. And I think that's where our place is.
Right. Okay, somebody suggests that the physical universe is not evolving and human society is not evolving, and neither is the church. We'd agree about the church. However, we'll move on. Is anyone challenging the church leaders to distinguish between avoiding support for political parties while speaking out about the major justice issues of today, particularly in Australia, of climate change and Indigenous issues? Francis, perhaps.
Well, I don't know, but if we look at the track record, what do bishops speak out about? With gusto and passion, always life issues, be it abortion or euthanasia. On the social teaching issues of the church, they can be very, very guarded because they get paranoid that they appear to be taking party political positions. You know, I have to say, in our own diocese, I'm gobsmacked that, you know, from our Archbishop down, there is a hesitancy, actually a refusal to put banners around parishes saying refugees welcome when we have Refugee Week, because someone's told a bishop somewhere, oh, that's too political. Yet in the next breath, whenever something's said about human sexuality, the bishops jump on the bandwagon even before it started. So I think this is a real point for us, which demonstrates how, from the episcopal leadership position, the church is getting smaller and smaller in the public square. And in a sense, falling back on piety and old devotion ways, when what we're really needing is an engagement of our community. I don't think any of us fully appreciate the meta crisis we're confronting. And we know there's a climate collapse going on of which we're participating in. And, you know, it can all sound pretty bleak, but at least Pope Francis has been raising the flag around needing a whole integral ecological approach. But we don't hear that much from our own bishops. As a matter of fact, we might hear it a lot more from our bishops if that became one of the KPIs the Pope put on them about their performance.
Thank you. And someone has asked, and Francis has to some extent answered this, do you think Pope Francis is supportive of the issues presented tonight and is waiting for the people to rise up and demand such changes? Kevin, do you?
Well, his document on promoting theology would say that he's very much in favour of a much greater role for the sense of the faith of the faithful, the taking into account the experience of people when we're developing theology, rather than just looking at the history of the scriptures and tradition. That would certainly imply that he is focusing on that. But I don't know what he's actually thinking, because he ranges over so many things. Yeah. That's.
Yep.
But
Francis.
How do we go?
Well, if we just take it from a political perspective, even though they keep on telling us the synod process is not meant to be political, I would be very surprised if those around the Pope who would have had their eyes on the drafting of this document would have let too many things through that wasn't in the perspective of the Pope. So my sense is that the things that are in the document and the, if you like, the potential in the document do reflect the mindset of the Pope. Will he go into brave and bold areas? Wait and see. I know some people said it was disappointing about the Amazon Synod and the issue around married priests or whatever it was. And I think that's a cross. But this is a pretty significant moment, which is meant to be the compilation of what all the churches have been saying around the world. And to have the issues still on the table and then to not advance them with a degree of transparency runs a huge risk. And my sense is the document does reflect his intentions.
And sort of following up on that, and either of you can decide who would like to speak on it, the recent letter to the German bishops, the Pope expressing concerns about the sort of permanent establishment of a German Synodal Council. Does that not seem to be going against some of the things he's been saying about the fact that we need synodal councils?
Yeah, I see that as he has taking responsibility for keeping the whole show together, and he doesn't want to let it into other people's hands too far. He wants to keep some sort of control on it, but he can. he's between a rock and a hard place in that regard, because I think on the one hand he would support that subsidiarity of the German church. On the other hand, he doesn't want it to float off into the ether like so many did in the Reformation.
Francis, any thoughts?
Well, you know, when I saw the news report, I felt pretty flat about it. You know, Francis is one of those guys that's 2 steps forward and all of a sudden we have 1 back. And this isn't the first time he's acted that way. There's probably wheels within wheels with this whole thing about Germany and the Vatican. What I would not like to see happen, though, is the notion of having synodal councils in each country and in each region of a country. Whether what the Germans were proposing because of their particular way in which the administration of the church goes there now anyway is different, I don't know. But we must have something like synodal councils. It's when you go to the bishops' conference meetings in Australia, the only lay people there are the paid employees, right? There is no dialogue with the lay community on big issues that matter. And you can't rely on the Catholic media because they're all under the thumb of their local bishop. With the exception, I have to say, of Eureka Street and I'm talking diocesan papers.
Yep.
Please, no hate mail for that.
Yep. Okay. Moving on to some different themes. Somebody says that the equity and gender issues are really very important, but there's also still the absolute importance of the people who suffered the scourge of abuse and how we can engage with them and what can we do to engage with them. And then I guess thinking about the abuse scourge, what else should we be doing in relation to clericalism? But we'll talk first, ask your questions first about dealing with the scourge of abuse.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Given that it's your back.
Look, throughout the whole period of the Royal Commission, the principle was that victims came first. We would listen to stories, we would learn. Post the commission, when the scrutiny is away from the church, many areas have fallen back to old ways and rely much more on a quasi-pastoral legal approach. We need more transparency about how the church is really dealing with victims. We need clarity about what are the long-term pastoral care arrangements for victims. We need a lot more openness about how people, if they want to be integrated back into Catholic communities and churches, how that goes. It's just not in our public record. And frankly, as we know, there are stories too regularly that remind us of the scandal and remind us that the Catholic Church should no longer be investigating itself.
Thank you. How do you...
Something there, Eleanor, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not directly answering, I think, the question, but for this and for other reasons, I think there needs to be a strong voice of lay people. The clergy and the managers, they're the people who are responsible for the organization, and they have a responsibility to, as they see it, and as anybody would, to look out for the good of the organization and to see to that. That bias, or it can become a bias very easily in protecting the good name of the church, as it has been talked about in the past. I think there needs to be another voice among Catholics, which is the voice of lay people, the people who are not involved in those positions of responsibility. As Francis just mentioned, it's not good enough for an organization to be examining itself and checking on itself. But within the church, we have this possibility of the organization element being critiqued by lay people who themselves don't have a direct stake in, they said, the financial outcomes of abuse cases, for instance. And I think we need to develop that very strongly and be clear where we stand.
Thank you. And moving on to something which is related, the scourge of clericalism. Francis, how can we get rid of that? And do we think that it's a heresy? Or at least that male autocracy as part of clericalism is a heresy?
Well, we know already from the Royal Commission report that one of the contributing factors to the sex abuse scandal was clericalism. And we've heard from Pope Francis a number of times of the evil scourge of clericalism. And I think we all have to appreciate it's not just clerics that are into clericalism. A lot of us put clerics on pedestals. A lot of us contribute to the atmosphere around the way power is exercised in the church to the detriment of many. It's very interesting in the synthesis document that they start talking about monitoring the performance of bishops and clerics, because that is one of the things the Truth, Justice and Healing Council called for, that there would be not only better formation of people who clerics and religious, but ongoing performance assessment and what they call supervision, and encouraging individuals to get into continuous improvement in their roles. Also, we need to be more open about how we as lay people sometimes in the church act as if we're the priests and religious and try to lord it over others. That's part of clericalism. It's always about the misuse of authority, where you use power. And if you want to summarize where we're up to, power, participation, and privilege are three things that have been ascribed to a class of people in the church, normally clerics. The canon law has facilitated that. And the hope out of this synod is that part of the canon law reform is to get at the heart of that.
Thank you. Kevin.
Yep. Wherever there is privilege, there's an element of it, and it's very difficult, as well as power. It's very difficult. Going back not too very long in terms of church thing, there was a very distinct sense of the clergy were the ones who knew how to run the show, and the lay people went along with that. That was they were told how to do it. That's changing, and an educated laity is going to change that very much, and it's holding the those with the authority or with the inside knowledge, if you like, to account. I think is where it's going to deal with it. There was a question earlier on, I just noticed in the chat, that about the equality of baptism, and then why not have lay people performing anointings, baptisms, and others. I think a lot of the issue is the reservation of many of those things to a special class of people when they don't need to be. As Peter Johnson points out, the canon law states clearly that the ordained have the power of governance in the church. And then in another canon, it says only men can be ordained. It's a non sequitur in the sense, why should it be? Yeah. And the question of what does ordaining mean doesn't get answered.
Thank you. And we have questions from what do we say to our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender intersex, queer, asexual, and non-binary Catholics and their families who have to continuously face outright editing out, abuse, erasure, silence, and dehumanization. Including the plenary and the synod, how do we give them some hope?
I think there are two ways of looking at this, as I tried to make the point that we have the organization, we have the movement. Essentially, Catholicism and Christianity is a movement that Jesus got going. The organization came much later. And the organization is there in order to help the movement along. I think most Catholics welcome LGBTIQ plus people into their company, into their friendship, into their events and whatever they're doing. There's probably a minority. And it's certainly not the position of the official position in relation to LGBTIQ is not held by the majority of Catholics. So to say that the church rejects or sidelines those people is not quite accurate, but the organization does it. And it's a difficulty in terms of how do you deal with the organization, then how do you bring it around in a hierarchical church where all the accountabilities are up the way. The parish priest is accountable to the bishop is accountable to the Vatican, and the Vatican is accountable to the Pope. But of course, the Vatican people ignore the Pope whenever they can, and bishops ignore the Vatican, and parish priests ignore the bishop. The whole thing is in many ways dysfunctional, which is why I think that it's the greatest proof of the existence of the Holy Spirit, that it has existed despite all of that. And it goes the other way too, because quite often lay people ignore the priest in terms of what they believe in. Priests ignore their bishop whenever they can. Bishops ignore what comes from Rome. They're very selective about that. But it's that, who is the church that is rejecting them?
Yes, good answer. Thank you. And perhaps a last question as we get closer to our wrap up. Thinking, because we're in Australia, an Australian church, how can we best engage with Aboriginal theology and the spirituality? Francis, perhaps to start with.
I'm not particularly qualified to answer that, besides saying the first thing that I always understand about engaging with anything with the Indigenous community is to engage with the Indigenous community, have the dialogue, ask, learn from them. What would work in our situations? How can we share insights around spirituality? There are places like Campfire in the Heart in Alice Springs, which I'm involved with. The whole point is to be a place also for reconciliation, but also of engagement with Indigenous spirituality. There are people working in social services that are reaching out to disadvantaged Indigenous communities in our cities. And part of that is giving them a sense of meaning and purpose and confidence, which is a form, as Kevin mentioned earlier, of spirituality. So as we've been counselled for many decades now, it's not doing to, it's doing with.
Yep.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah. I see the Aboriginal and Indigenous spirituality as very much part of the whole lot of spirituality. Our organization and a lot of our theologians have really done us a disservice in the ways in which they have defined theology. And they have taken it beginning with a sense of what Christianity deals with, and the definitions very often are how to come to definitions. And they do it with that tendency to theorize and put things into neat theories. Life isn't like that. One of the great blessings, I think, of Celtic spirituality is that the Celts never really got rid of the pre-Christian religion that existed. They brought it into their Christian religion, and there are traces of it still there in various ways. And I think that we need to broaden our notion of what is religion, what is spirituality. Instead of trying to say, well, this is Catholic or Christian spirituality, we need to look at people, wherever they are, and acknowledge what their spirituality is and say, this is our spirituality.
Thank you. We'll finish the questions and answers now, and we haven't got to answer them all, but they will be as part of the, you'll see them, the comments. I might just finish with one comment, which is, if our hearts and minds are really open, Francis is telling us to get on with it in every way we can. So a positive vibe to say we can do this and we should be doing it. And I'd like to hand over to Trish Hindmarsh, who Trish is from Tasmania currently. She's been a leader in Concerned Catholics Tasmania since its inception in 2019. She was Director of Catholic Education in Tasmania from 2009 till 2014. And prior to that, she had senior roles in Catholic education in other states. Thank you very much, Trish.
Thanks very much, Eleanor. Tonight's title for the webinar is really telling: Evolving Catholicism and the Synod. And tonight, I think we've had a wide-ranging conversation and probably coming to the conclusion that, yes, the Church is definitely evolving. And in fact, the Synod itself, as a process, has evolved. We have those wonderful images of the serried ranks of cardinals, all in red, looking serious and almost prosperous, sitting in their rows. And now we have that different approach to Synod. We have women there, we have laity there, we have experts. We had the Pope during the Synod calling in Pariti with a small p, such as Janine Gramick, who was called in to speak to him about the LGBTIQ+ issue and share with him her human experience of supporting those people for 50 years, a fearless nun. And also Father James Martin came during the Synod to have dinner with the Pope. The Pope is listening, open. So I'd like to say first how grateful I am that we have men and women, of course, but not so much tonight. We have men like Francis and Kevin, who are faithful Catholics, who have a critical lens, but are prepared to hang in to their faith and be inspired by their spirituality, as Kevin mentioned, and to be driven towards creating a more evolved and faithful church. This is reason to rejoice. I remember Vatican II so well. I remember last week Sister Natalie Garratt describing the Synod as Vatican II continuing. Marvellous times we're living in. Pope John the 23rd talked about the windows opening. Kevin mentioned tonight the door opening a little. I think the doors are going to be opening very, very fully in the next few years. And I'm grateful that I'm not going to God before all of this has been put in train. It's a very exciting time to be alive, as my religious education teacher used to remind us girls in Year 12. I'd like to also say that we've really examined what ordinary Catholics have in their hearts and their minds, whoever they are. We meet them at Mass every Sunday in our church. Ordinary Catholics, they want to live a good life. In Australia, 270,000 ordinary so-called Catholics, and not so ordinary ones, highly educated ones like the two we've heard from tonight. Catholics all around the country came to the conclusion that the most important tenet of our faith is the Great Commandment. And look, I found that astonishing. And I think Pope Francis embodies that. I think of the leadership in the church now that's encouraging not only the women at the Synod and women taking positions, but those people labouring in the slums, working for all those refugees and the issues that we mentioned towards the end of the question time. I'm really encouraged by those people. And I think that there's a really good example in Cardinal Garratt. Cardinal Garratt, apparently, when he was Bishop of Malta, he met one of the families who had 3 trans children. Over 8 years, he followed that family. He went to the conference of the parents. They founded an order of laity, really, to support their children. And he went to their meetings and then, of course, was called to Rome. The Pope rang him up when he was in the supermarket and said, I'd like you to come and have lunch with me. And the next question the Pope said was, do you have any special dietary needs? I love this kind of down-to-earth leadership. It's the opposite of clericalism. Bring it on. And I think tonight we've talked about clericalism. We've used a critical lens to say we've got a long way to go to overcome clericalism, but we now have shining models of that. You're probably gathering that I'm quite optimistic about the Synod, and I think that the sense of the faithful, which was reflected in those 270,000 submissions and the consultations globally now, and the German meetings, those sorts of sense of the faithful expressions are, as both of our speakers brought out, genuine reasons to rejoice in the power of the Spirit. The spirituality, we touched on the idea now that spirituality is very personal and real for people, not dependent on what was handed to us on a plate, but we need to have more emphasis now on the whole evolutionary new story of where we've come from and weave that into our spirituality, and was totally absent as far as I could see in the Synod. So there was a mention at the end that the Church tends to move towards the centre in the interest of not creating schism and division. That's not an excuse for being bold and forthright. And I think we can be grateful that we have these bold and forthright people in the reform and renewal movements of the Church, but also in numbers of our leaders at the hierarchical level now too. So I really rejoice that we've had this meeting tonight, and also rejoice that we are an evolving Catholicism, Catholicity, Catholic Church, and we live in a synodal time, which is an evolving way of becoming better humans for a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trish, for a very powerful summing up. And I'd just like to thank very much Kevin and Francis, who spent quite a bit of time preparing for this and thinking through their thoughts on this. A couple of people have asked for whether it would be possible to have the transcripts of their speeches, and they'll be provided, and we'll put those on the ACCCR website. So they'll be available in the next week. And of course, you'll get a link. Those of you who've registered will get a link to the video, so you can re-watch it, or your friends or colleagues who might want to watch it. So really, just to thank Kevin, Francis and Patricia very much for their work and effort. Thanks, James, for making the whole thing run. And thank you all for being part of this and for asking such very good questions. And I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them. And good night.